He had been trained to survive the impossible, but nothing in his life had prepared him for what he found frozen on his front porch. Before this story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from, because every place has its own winter, and every heart has its own miracle waiting to happen. If stories about courage, loyalty, and second chances mean something to you, take a second to subscribe. And when you have listened all the way to the end, leave a comment about the moment that touched you most. Your words help us tell even better stories for people who still believe kindness can change a life. Montana had been buried beneath snow for 3 straight days. The wind swept across the valley with a hollow whistle that rattled pine branches and pushed powdery drifts against every cabin for miles. Temperatures had dropped below 10 degrees, and the sunrise struggled to push pale gold through heavy gray clouds. Lieutenant Mason Carter, an active-duty Navy SEAL, stood alone inside his small lakeside cabin, wrapping both hands around a mug of black coffee that had already begun losing its warmth. At 35, Mason carried the quiet confidence of a man who had survived missions few people would ever know existed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, white, with weathered hazel eyes that rarely lingered on anything for long. Dark hair cropped close, a trimmed beard, and just beneath the left side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his thermal shirt, rested the tattoo of a German shepherd's face, inked years earlier to honor the military working dog that had once saved his entire team overseas. After that, he had never owned another dog. Some memories were too sacred for noise. The cabin itself was modest, built from cedar logs that smelled faintly of pine resin and would smoke. A stone fireplace crackled softly in the corner while frost traced delicate patterns across the windows. Outside, the world looked untouched, almost unreal beneath the blanket of fresh snow. Mason reached for his heavy coat, planning to shovel the porch before driving back to base. The weather report promised another storm by noon. He unlocked the front door, turned the brass handle, and stepped into the freezing morning. The cold struck his face like a wall. His breath formed a white cloud that drifted away with the wind. Then he stopped moving. Something lay curled against the far corner of the porch beside an old wooden rocking chair. At first glance, it looked like just another snowdrift. Then he noticed a single ear beneath the ice crystals. A German shepherd. She barely resembled the proud working dogs Mason remembered. Snow had gathered across her back until her sable coat blended into the frozen porch. Thin ribs pressed against her side beneath patches of frost. Her paws were tucked tightly beneath her body, as though she had spent every last ounce of strength trying to stay warm. Her eyes were closed. She didn't move. Mason slowly knelt beside her. Years of military training taught him to observe before acting. No collar, no leash, no tracks leading toward the porch. He looked across the untouched yard stretching nearly 50 yards to the tree line. Fresh snow covered everything in one smooth sheet of white. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no signs of another person. Nothing. It was as if the dog had simply appeared out of the storm. He removed one glove and carefully touched her shoulder. The fur felt stiff from the cold. For one long heartbeat, nothing happened at all. Mason lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice almost carried away by the wind. Then something so small happened that another man might have missed it entirely. One ear twitched. Barely. Almost imperceptibly. Mason froze. He leaned closer until he could hear only the wind and his own breathing. There it was again. A faint, fragile movement followed by the weakest exhale he had ever heard. She was still alive. His eyes traveled lower, and only then did he notice the gentle curve beneath her thin frame. She wasn't alone. She was pregnant. Whatever had driven her through the storm, whatever miles she had crossed before collapsing at his door, she had carried more than her own life across that frozen wilderness. Mason slipped both arms beneath her trembling body with the same careful precision he once used lifting wounded teammates. She weighed far, less than she should have. As he raised her from the icy boards, a tiny clump of snow fell away, revealing the outline of an old leather collar buried beneath frost, its faded metal tag completely unreadable. The wind howled louder behind him as he carried her across the threshold, and the cabin door closed with a quiet click that seemed to leave the storm outside. Neither one of them knew it yet, but that single step would become the dividing line between the lives they had survived and the lives they were about to begin together. The warmth inside the cabin felt almost holy against the bitter cold still clinging to her frozen coat. Mason laid the German Shepherd carefully on a thick wool blanket beside the stone fireplace, moving with the calm precision that years of military service had carved into his instincts. He didn't rush. Panic had never saved anyone. Steady hands had. He removed his heavy gloves, grabbed another blanket from an old cedar chest, and gently wrapped it around her trembling body. The fire cracked softly as orange light danced across the room, chasing away the icy blue shadows that had followed them inside. Her breathing remained dangerously shallow, each faint breath separated by long, uneasy silences that seemed to stretch forever. Mason knelt beside her and rested 2 fingers against the inside of her hind leg, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak, irregular, but present. He released a quiet breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The dog was still fighting. That was enough for him to keep fighting too. He hurried into the kitchen, filled a large pot with warm water, and returned with clean towels. One by one he soaked them, wrung them out, and laid them gently across her shoulders, chest, and legs. He knew enough to avoid shocking a body that had been trapped in freezing temperatures. Slow warmth, gentle warmth, patient warmth. Outside, another gust of wind slammed against the cabin walls, making the windows rattle. Snow drifted past the glass like endless white ghosts. Mason glanced toward the weather radio sitting on the counter. The announcer warned that another winter front was expected before noon, bringing heavier snowfall and dangerous road conditions across western Montana. He reached for his satellite phone instead. After several attempts, the line finally connected. Dr. Emily Brooks answered from the veterinary clinic nearly 30 miles away. Her voice crackled beneath bursts of static. Mason explained everything with practiced clarity. Female German Shepherd. Pregnant. Severe exposure to cold. Barely responsive. Dr. Brooks asked careful questions before giving equally careful instructions. Keep her warm. Do not force food. Offer only small amounts of lukewarm water if she wakes enough to swallow. Watch for labor because severe stress could trigger early delivery. Mason thanked her, but before ending the call he asked the question already weighing on his mind. Can you make it here? Silence lingered for several seconds before the doctor answered honestly. Lieutenant, if these roads close, nobody will reach your cabin today. I will come the moment it is safe, but until then, she is depending on you. The connection disappeared. Mason stared at the silent phone for a moment before setting it aside. She is depending on you. Those words echoed through the quiet cabin. He looked back toward the fireplace. The dog's ears twitched ever so slightly. Encouraged, he poured a small amount of lukewarm water into a shallow bowl and gently touched it to her lips. At first there was no response. Then her tongue moved just enough to take a single sip. Another. Then she rested again, exhausted by the effort. That's it, Mason whispered. Nice and easy. His voice sounded unfamiliar in the empty cabin. Soft, patient, almost fatherly. He had spent years giving commands that carried across helicopters, oceans, and training grounds. This was different. These words were meant for one frightened soul struggling simply to stay alive. As he adjusted the blanket once more, something caught his attention beneath the frost-covered leather collar. A small brass tag had been hidden beneath layers of ice. He carefully warmed it between his fingers until a few worn letters slowly appeared through the frost. Most of the engraving had faded beyond recognition, but one word remained barely visible. Hope. Mason repeated it quietly. Hope. The dog's ears shifted at the sound. Not much, just enough to notice. A faint sigh escaped her as though somewhere beneath exhaustion she still recognized her own name. Mason smiled almost without realizing it. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in months. He brushed a few melting ice crystals away from her forehead and noticed something else. Her abdomen tightened for only a second before relaxing again. Then it happened once more. A slow contraction. His expression changed immediately. Dr. Brooks had warned him this could happen. Her puppies were coming, much sooner than anyone had hoped. Outside, the wind roared across the frozen lake as dark clouds swallowed the last traces of morning sunlight, and inside the little cedar cabin, Mason understood that the real battle had only just begun. The cabin slipped into an uneasy silence broken only by the steady crackle of burning cedar and the mournful wind circling outside. Mason pulled another log onto the fire and watched sparks drift upward before disappearing into the chimney. The warmth slowly returned to the room, but it didn't erase the weight pressing against his chest. Hope rested on the blanket with her eyes still closed, her breathing steadier now. Yet every few minutes another gentle contraction rippled through her tired body. Mason checked the clock on the mantel. Less than an hour had passed since he carried her inside, but it already felt like an entire day. He crouched beside her once more and lightly placed his hand against her shoulder. Her fur was finally beginning to lose its icy stiffness. "You're doing better," he said quietly. "Just keep holding on." The words surprised even him. He had not spoken this much in weeks. After years of serving on missions where silence often meant survival, conversation had become something he avoided. Even when he returned to base between deployments, he preferred early morning training runs, long hours at the range, and quiet evenings alone rather than crowded rooms filled with stories he never wanted to tell. Most people assumed he just liked being alone. The truth was harder than that. Solitude asked no questions, and it never expected answers. His eyes drifted toward the old framed photograph resting above the fireplace. 6 men stood shoulder to shoulder wearing desert camouflage beneath a blazing Middle Eastern sun. Beside them sat a powerful German shepherd wearing a tactical harness, ears high, eyes fixed on the camera as though guarding every man in the picture. Mason reached for the frame almost without thinking. His thumb brushed across the familiar face of the dog. Atlas. Years earlier, Atlas had alerted the team to danger before anyone else noticed it. That single moment had changed everything, allowing every member of the unit to return home safely. Mason still remembered kneeling beside the remarkable dog afterward, pressing his forehead gently against Atlas while whispering a simple promise. "I will never forget you." When Atlas grew old and passed away after retirement, Mason had driven hundreds of miles to attend the quiet ceremony held by his former handler. A few weeks later, he had the German Shepherd tattoo placed along the side of his neck. It was never meant to impress anyone. It was a promise written into his own skin. His thoughts returned to the present when Hope let out a soft whimper barely louder than the fire itself. Her front paw shifted weakly against the blanket, searching without knowing what it sought. Mason gently offered his hand. After a hesitant moment, her paw rested across his fingers. The pressure was almost nothing, yet somehow it carried more trust than words ever could. He smiled faintly. "You found the right porch," he whispered. Outside, the weather grew darker. Snowflakes thickened until the forest beyond the windows disappeared completely behind a curtain of white. The weather radio crackled again with another advisory. Roads throughout the county were officially closed. Emergency travel was strongly discouraged. Mason switched the radio off. He already knew nobody was coming. Not today. Whatever happened next would happen inside this cabin. He gathered clean towels, filled another pot with warm water, and carefully arranged everything beside the fireplace exactly as Dr. Emily Brooks had instructed. Every movement reflected years of disciplined preparation. A mission was never won after chaos began. It was won by preparing before it arrived. Hope suddenly lifted her head just enough to glance toward him. For the first time their eyes truly met. Her amber eyes looked tired, frightened, yet strangely peaceful, as though she had finally reached the place she had been searching for through miles of snow and bitter wind. Mason noticed fresh tears collecting at the corners of her eyes before they slipped quietly into her fur. He reached forward and gently scratched behind one ear. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. Hope released a slow breath and lowered her head again. But this time she didn't curl into herself. Instead, she settled a little closer to the warmth of the fire and a little closer to the man sitting beside her. Then another contraction came, stronger than the last. Hope's breathing quickened. Mason glanced toward the carefully prepared towels, then back to the frightened mother whose trust now rested entirely in his hands. The storm outside had sealed every road, but inside the cabin another journey was beginning, one that neither soldier nor dog could walk alone. The afternoon light faded earlier than it should have, swallowed by thick storm clouds that pressed low over the frozen valley. Snow continued to gather against the cabin walls until the windows looked like pale sheets of frosted glass. Inside, the fire burned brighter, filling the room with the comforting scent of cedar and warm stone. Mason stayed beside Hope without once looking at the clock. Time had become meaningless. The only rhythm that mattered was the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Another contraction came, longer this time. Hope let out a quiet whine and lifted her head, searching the room with tired amber eyes before settling them on Mason once again. She no longer looked like a frightened stray. She looked like someone silently asking whether she could trust the man sitting beside her. Mason answered without words. He simply remained there, calm, steady, present. He dipped a clean cloth into warm water and gently wiped the melting ice from around her face and neck. As the frost disappeared, he noticed several faint scars hidden beneath her thick sable coat. None appeared fresh. They were the kind left behind by a difficult life, old reminders that healing had once been possible before. Hope leaned slightly into the warmth of the towel, then closed her eyes again. Her breathing slowed for several minutes before another wave tightened across her body. Mason reached for the satellite phone and managed to reconnect with Dr. Emily Brooks after several attempts. The signal faded in and out beneath the storm, but her voice remained calm. She asked him to describe everything carefully. He counted the contractions. He explained Hope's breathing. He described her strength, her awareness, and the condition of the cabin. Dr. Brooks paused before speaking again. "Lieutenant, based on what you are telling me, labor has definitely begun. I wish I could be there, but the sheriff has already closed every mountain road. You may have to help deliver those puppies yourself." Mason looked toward the snow-covered windows. "How long until someone can reach us?" Another brief silence followed. "If the weather improves, maybe tomorrow morning. If it does not, you are on your own until then." The line crackled before fading away once more. Mason placed the phone on the table and quietly accepted the reality before him. Every mission eventually reached a point when backup was only a word. This was one of those moments. He gathered fresh blankets, filled another kettle with water, and placed a flashlight beside the fireplace in case the electricity failed. Every item rested within easy reach. Every movement reflected discipline learned through years of preparing for uncertainty. Hope stirred again. This time she struggled to sit upright before losing her balance. Mason immediately supported her shoulders without forcing her. She rested against his arm for several seconds, breathing harder than before. Then something unexpected happened. Hope slowly lowered her nose toward his neck. She paused directly over the German Shepherd tattoo hidden beneath his collar. Her nose twitched once, twice. Then she gave the faintest touch, almost like a kiss against the faded ink, before settling back onto the blanket. Mason remained completely still. A quiet memory drifted through his mind. Years ago, Atlas had often greeted him the exact same way after returning safely from training exercises, touching that same spot before wagging his tail. Mason swallowed hard. "You recognized him somehow, didn't you?" he whispered, though he knew there was no answer anyone could explain. Outside, the wind rose into another mournful howl that echoed across the frozen lake. The cabin lights flickered once, then steadied again. Hope suddenly became restless. She shifted her weight, circled awkwardly across the blankets, then stopped and looked directly at Mason. Her breathing grew faster. Her muscles tightened. Another contraction rolled through her body, stronger than any before. This time it didn't pass quickly. Dr. Brooks had warned him this moment would come. Mason knelt beside her, placed one reassuring hand gently against her shoulder, and spoke with the calm confidence that had carried frightened teammates through impossible nights. "You're not alone anymore, Hope. We are going to do this together." As if she understood every word, Hope looked into his eyes, released one slow, trembling breath, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, she stopped shaking from fear. The storm outside continued to rage without mercy, but beside the glowing fireplace, surrounded by warmth, quiet courage, and unwavering trust, a new life was preparing to enter the world. The first real sign came just after sunset. Hope drew in a long, trembling breath and lifted her head toward the darkened window as another powerful contraction rippled through her exhausted body. Snow hammered softly against the glass, and somewhere beyond the frozen trees, the wind carried a lonely sound across the valley before fading into silence. Mason remained beside her, one hand resting gently against her shoulder, counting each breath the way he had once counted every heartbeat during emergency rescue drills. He remembered Dr. Emily Brooks saying that calm was contagious. If he remained steady, Hope would feel it too. He looked into her tired, Amber eyes and gave a quiet nod. "You're stronger than you think." She answered with a faint wag of her tail, barely enough to move the edge of the blanket. It was the smallest gesture, yet it filled the room with hope greater than the fire itself. The lights flickered again. Once, twice. Then the cabin fell into darkness. Only the orange glow from the fireplace remained, painting warm shadows across the log walls. Mason immediately reached for the flashlight he had prepared earlier, setting it nearby, without shining it directly into Hope's eyes. Years of training had taught him that preparation was never wasted. Outside, the power lines had surrendered to the storm, leaving the entire mountainside wrapped in darkness. He added another split log to the fire, careful to keep the room comfortably warm without overheating it. The crackling flames reflected in Hope's eyes as another contraction arrived, stronger and closer than the last. She tried to stand, circled slowly across the blankets, then lowered herself again with a soft whimper. Mason watched carefully, remembering every instruction the veterinarian had shared over the satellite phone. He spoke in a calm, even voice, not because Hope understood every word, but because fear always sounded louder in silence. "That's it. Nice and easy. One breath at a time." Hope's breathing gradually matched the rhythm of his voice. For a few precious minutes, the cabin seemed suspended outside of time. The storm continued its relentless march beyond the walls, but inside there was only the steady fire, the scent of cedar, and two living souls refusing to surrender. Mason stepped quietly into the kitchen and warmed another bowl of water before returning with fresh towels. Hope accepted a few careful sips, then rested her head against his knee. He gently stroked behind her ears, feeling the tension slowly leave her body between contractions. His eyes drifted toward the faded brass tag resting beside the blanket after he had carefully removed the old collar to make her more comfortable. The single word engraved upon it still caught the firelight. Hope. It felt less like a name now and more like a promise. Suddenly Hope lifted her head and stared toward the front door. Her ears stood halfway despite her exhaustion. Mason listened. At first he heard nothing except the wind. Then came a dull thump somewhere outside. He stood, slipping into his heavy boots before carefully opening the door only a few inches. A blast of freezing air swept inside along with swirling snow. He scanned the porch with his flashlight. There was nothing there except deep drifts of fresh powder already covering the footprints he had left earlier that morning. He closed the door quickly, locking out the cold once again. As he turned back toward the fireplace, Hope let out a deeper cry than before. Another contraction seized her body, lasting longer this time. Mason hurried back to her side and immediately understood that the waiting was over. This was no longer early labor. This was the moment they had been preparing for since he carried her through the front door. He placed one reassuring hand beneath her neck while the other rested lightly against her shoulder. Hope looked directly into his eyes, frightened but trusting, and the room became perfectly still. Even the storm seemed to pause for a single heartbeat as the quiet miracle waiting inside that little mountain cabin prepared to take its very first breath. Then Hope's breathing changed. It became slower between contractions but deeper during each wave, as though every ounce of strength she still possessed was being gathered for one final purpose. Mason remained beside her without moving more than a few inches, watching every small change with quiet concentration. The fire continued to burn steadily, filling the cabin with a comforting warmth that stood in gentle defiance against the blizzard roaring outside. Snow pressed against the windows until the world beyond disappeared completely. There was no road anymore, no distant cabin lights, no promise that help would arrive before morning. Only the storm and the small circle of light surrounding the fireplace. Hope lifted her head and released a soft cry that carried neither fear nor pain alone. It sounded more like determination. Mason remembered something an old combat medic had once told him during survival training. Sometimes courage is not loud. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to stop breathing. He looked into Hope's tired amber eyes and nodded. "That is exactly what we are going to do," he whispered. "We keep breathing." Another contraction rolled through her body. This one lingered longer than all the others. Mason reached for the satellite phone one more time, hoping the weather might have eased enough for another connection. After several failed attempts, a weak signal finally reached Dr. Emily Brooks. Her voice faded in and out beneath heavy static, but Mason could still hear her instructions. She reminded him to stay calm, to let nature guide the process, to keep Hope warm, hydrated, and as comfortable as possible. Then her voice became even quieter. "Lieutenant, dogs are incredibly resilient. She has already chosen to trust you. That trust may be the greatest medicine she has tonight." Before Mason could answer, the connection disappeared once again. He stared at the silent phone for only a moment before setting it aside. The next part belonged to them alone. Hope shifted across the blankets, searching for a more comfortable position. Mason carefully supported her without forcing her movements. She leaned briefly against his arm before settling onto her side near the fire. Every few moments, she looked toward him, almost checking to make sure he had not gone anywhere. Each time their eyes met, Mason answered with the same calm expression. He had spent years leading men through uncertainty. Tonight, leadership meant something much simpler. Stay, listen, don't leave. The cabin grew remarkably quiet. Even the wind seemed farther away now, softened by the thick blanket of fresh snow surrounding the little cedar home. The only sounds were the crackling logs, Hope's measured breathing, and the steady ticking of the old clock above the mantel. Mason found himself speaking again, not because Hope needed instructions, but because the words had been trapped inside him for far too long. "There was another dog once," he said softly. "His name was Atlas. He never quit on us. He believed every mission had a way home. I think you would have liked him." Hope opened one eye and slowly thumped her tail against the blanket. The tiny movement brought an unexpected smile to Mason's face. "You probably remind me of him more than I want to admit." For the first time in years, the silence inside his heart felt less empty. Another contraction came, stronger than before. Hope instinctively pressed closer to him, and Mason rested his hand gently along her shoulder. "You're doing exactly what you need to do," he said in the same steady voice. "You don't have to rush. We will welcome them together." Hope closed her eyes again, her breathing matching the calm rhythm of his words. Outside, the storm continued to blanket the mountains in endless white, but inside the cabin something invisible had already changed. This was no longer the story of a soldier rescuing a forgotten dog. It had quietly become the story of two wounded souls carrying each other through the longest night either of them had ever known. Then Hope suddenly became very still. Her ears lifted. Her breathing deepened. Mason recognized the change immediately. The waiting was ending. A new chapter was about to begin, and the little cabin filled with firelight seemed to hold its breath alongside them. The night kept stretching without mercy. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers, casting a gentle amber light that flickered across the cedar walls while the storm continued to bury the mountains outside beneath fresh layers of snow. Mason had long since stopped thinking about the passing hours. Every bit of his attention remained fixed on Hope. Her breathing, once steady beneath his calm voice, suddenly became uneven again. Another contraction came, stronger than any before, followed by a long silence that felt unnaturally heavy. Hope lowered her head onto the blanket and closed her eyes. Mason immediately leaned closer, resting one hand softly against her shoulder. "Stay with me," he whispered. Her ears gave only the faintest movement. He reached for the bowl of warm water and gently touched it near her mouth, but this time she didn't respond. The room seemed to grow colder, even with the fire still burning beside them. Mason checked her breathing again. It was there, but much weaker than before. Slow, faint, fragile. He remembered Dr. Emily Brooks warning him that exhaustion could become the greatest enemy during a difficult labor. He quietly rubbed Hope's shoulders with a warm towel, speaking to her in the same calm voice that had carried them through the evening. "You have already come farther than anyone expected. You don't have to be afraid. Just keep breathing." For several long moments, nothing changed. The only sound inside the cabin was the soft ticking of the old mantel clock. Outside, the wind no longer howled. Instead, an eerie silence settled across the valley, the kind that often arrived in the very center of a heavy snowstorm. Mason glanced toward the frosted window. Even the pine trees stood perfectly still beneath the weight of fresh snow. The entire world seemed to be waiting. Hope suddenly opened her eyes. She looked directly at Mason with quiet exhaustion, then slowly turned her head toward the fireplace. Her gaze lingered on the dancing flames before returning to him once more. She lifted one trembling paw and rested it weakly against his wrist. Mason gently wrapped his fingers around it. "I am here," he said softly. "You're not alone." Hope released one long breath. Then another. Her body relaxed completely against the blankets. For the first time since he had found her on the porch, there were no contractions, no movement, no quiet whimpers, only stillness. Mason's heartbeat quickened. He leaned closer, searching for the steady rhythm of her breathing. Another second passed, then another. The breaths became so faint that he could barely tell whether they were still there at all. Fear crept quietly into the room, not with panic, but with silence. It was the same silence Mason remembered after difficult missions, when everyone waited for someone to move, someone to speak, someone to prove that hope had not disappeared. He gently stroked Hope's head, brushing a loose strand of fur away from her eyes. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Not yet." His eyes drifted toward the old photograph of Atlas resting above the mantel. Memories filled the room without asking permission. The fearless military dog racing ahead through desert dust. The joyful bark after every successful mission. The quiet farewell years later beneath a clear blue sky. Mason had believed he had already experienced every goodbye life could demand from him. He realized now that he had been wrong. Hope's breathing became almost impossible to detect. The warmth in her paw remained, but her body lay completely still. Mason bowed his head. For the first time in many years, the disciplined Navy SEAL who had survived impossible missions closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer without worrying whether anyone was listening. He didn't ask for miracles. He didn't ask for answers. He simply asked that one exhausted mother be given another chance. The fire popped softly, sending a handful of tiny sparks dancing upward into the chimney. The cabin remained silent. The storm remained silent. Even the old clock seemed quieter than before. Mason opened his eyes once more and kept his hand gently resting over Hope's paw, refusing to let go, even as the long and painful stillness settled over the little cabin like the snow gathering endlessly outside. For a long moment, nothing happened. Mason remained exactly where he was, his hand resting gently over Hope's paw as the last glowing embers whispered inside the stone fireplace. He had learned long ago that some moments couldn't be rushed. Some battles were fought in complete silence. He watched her chest, searching for even the slightest rise, but the movement was almost impossible to see. The cabin felt suspended between night and morning, between despair and something that had not yet found its name. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he wondered if memory had created it. A tiny whimper, barely louder than the settling crack of burning cedar. Mason slowly lifted his head. His eyes moved toward Hope's abdomen. Another soft sound followed, delicate as the first snowflake of winter landing on still water. Hope's ears twitched. Only once. Then her nose quivered with the smallest breath. Mason leaned closer, hardly daring to move. "That's it," he whispered. "Come back one breath at a time." Hope answered with another. Fragile inhale. It was shallow, but stronger than the one before. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against exhaustion, until at last they opened halfway. The warm amber that had nearly faded now reflected the dancing firelight once again. She looked at Mason without fear, as though she had heard every word of his silent prayer. A deep breath escaped his own chest, one he had been holding without realizing it. The heaviness inside the cabin lifted just enough to let Hope enter again. Then another contraction rolled gently through Hope's body. This time it carried purpose instead of defeat. Mason remembered Dr. Emily Brooks explaining that exhaustion often came just before new strength. He wrapped another warm towel around Hope's shoulders and quietly encouraged her. "You're doing exactly what you were made to do. You're not alone." Hope rested for several seconds before shifting her body slightly closer to the warmth of the fire. Her breathing settled into a steadier rhythm. Outside, the wind that had screamed across the valley all night softened into little more than a whisper brushing against the snow-covered pines. It was as though the storm itself had finally grown tired. The silence was broken once more by an even smaller sound. A faint, high-pitched cry unlike anything Mason had heard all evening. He looked around the blankets in surprise before his eyes settled near Hope's hind legs. There, wrapped safely beneath the folds of warm wool, something tiny moved. A newborn puppy, no bigger than both of Mason's hands together, stretched weakly before letting out another gentle squeak. Mason felt tears gathering in his eyes before he even realized they were there. He smiled through them, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "Well," he whispered with a soft laugh, "there you are, little one." Hope immediately lifted her head despite her exhaustion and turned toward the tiny life beside her. Her expression changed completely. The fear that had filled her eyes all night quietly gave way to something older than fear itself. A mother's love. She gently lowered her nose toward the puppy, giving it the softest nudge before looking back at Mason as if to make sure he had seen the miracle too. He nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "I see." The tiny puppy let out another determined cry, stronger than the first, filling the cabin with a sound so small, yet so powerful that it seemed to chase away every shadow left by the long winter night. Hope's tail tapped softly against the blanket. Only once. It was enough. Mason carefully adjusted another clean towel around the newborn, making certain both mother and puppy remained warm beside the fire. The room no longer felt empty. It no longer felt like a room where life had nearly ended. Instead, it had become something entirely different. A sanctuary. Outside, the eastern horizon remained hidden behind thick clouds, but somewhere beyond them dawn was slowly making its way toward the mountains. Inside the little cedar cabin, where a weary Navy SEAL and a forgotten German Shepherd had endured the longest night together, the first quiet miracle had finally found its voice. The tiny cry echoed through the cabin like the first bird singing after a long winter. Mason sat motionless for several seconds, afraid that even the smallest movement might disturb the fragile miracle unfolding before him. The newborn puppy wiggled beneath the warm towel, letting out another determined little squeak that somehow sounded far louder than the roaring storm had only an hour earlier. Hope lowered her head with extraordinary gentleness, brushing the puppy with the tip of her nose before closing her eyes for a brief moment. She looked utterly exhausted, yet something inside her had changed. The fear was gone. In its place lived quiet purpose. Mason carefully checked the warmth around both mother and puppy before adding another split log to the fireplace. Bright flames climbed higher, filling the room with golden light and the comforting scent of cedar smoke. Outside, darkness still covered the mountains, but the fierce wind had almost disappeared. Snowflakes now drifted lazily instead of racing sideways through the air. It felt as though the world itself had decided to whisper rather than shout. Hope's breathing remained steady for several peaceful minutes before another contraction arrived. She lifted her head, immediately searching for Mason. He was already beside her. "I know," he said softly. "We are still in this together." She leaned into his hand for only a second before focusing again. The next few minutes passed in patient silence. Mason remembered Dr. Emily Brooks explaining that every birth followed its own rhythm. His job was not to hurry the process, but to protect it. He refreshed the warm towels, offered Hope another small drink of water, and spoke only when necessary. "Good girl. Nice and easy. You're doing beautifully." Hope accepted each quiet word as though they carried strength of their own. Another tiny movement beneath the blanket caught Mason's attention. The first puppy had somehow managed to inch closer to its mother's chest, guided by nothing more than instinct. Hope gently curled her front leg around the little one, creating a pocket of warmth with remarkable tenderness. Mason smiled. Nature often knew exactly what to do long before people understood it. Then another soft cry reached his ears. This one came from Hope herself, followed almost immediately by a fresh wave of effort. Mason watched carefully, remembering every instruction the veterinarian had given him over the satellite phone. Moments later, another tiny body appeared, equally small, equally determined to greet the world. This puppy was quieter than the first, resting peacefully against the warm blanket before giving a delicate little sigh. Mason carefully dried the newborn with a clean towel exactly as Dr. Brooks had described, then gently placed the puppy beside its sibling. Hope immediately turned toward both of them, counting each one with careful touches of her nose before looking back at Mason. Her tired amber eyes carried unmistakable gratitude. "They are beautiful," Mason whispered. His voice cracked slightly, surprising him. He had witnessed remarkable moments during years of military service. Homecomings, rescues, quiet acts of courage that few people would ever hear about. Yet nothing had prepared him for the simple beauty of watching two tiny lives breathe their very first breaths beside a mountain fireplace while snow covered the world outside. The old satellite phone suddenly emitted a faint beep. A weak signal had returned. Mason quickly answered. Dr. Emily Brooks sounded relieved the moment she heard his voice. He quietly explained what had happened. The veterinarian listened without interrupting before laughing softly with obvious joy. "Lieutenant," she said, "I think you just graduated from emergency delivery school." Mason glanced toward Hope, and the two sleeping puppies nestled safely against her side. "I think they deserve most of the credit," he answered. Dr. Brooks promised that rescue crews were already clearing the mountain roads and would reach the cabin as soon as daylight made travel safe. Until then, she encouraged him to keep everyone warm and let Hope rest. The call ended, leaving only the peaceful sounds of gentle breathing and the crackling fire. Mason looked toward the frosted window. A faint ribbon of silver had begun to appear beyond the eastern ridge. Dawn was finally arriving. After the longest night either of them had ever endured, its light didn't feel loud or dramatic. It arrived quietly, the same way grace often does, slipping gently into broken places until they no longer felt broken at all. Morning arrived quietly. The storm had finally spent itself, leaving the mountains wrapped in fresh snow that sparkled beneath the first pale rays of sunlight. Soft beams slipped through the frosted windows, painting golden lines across the wooden floor and warming the quiet cabin with a different kind of light. The fire still glowed gently inside the stone fireplace, and for the first time since Hope had appeared on the porch, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt alive and peaceful. Mason stood near the window with a steaming mug of coffee resting between his hands, watching thin ribbons of mist rise from the frozen lake below. The world looked completely different from the one that had greeted him the day before. Every pine tree carried a fresh white blanket. Every branch shimmered beneath tiny crystals of ice. The wilderness that had seemed so unforgiving now appeared almost gentle beneath the morning sun. Behind him came a tiny sound, then another. The soft little squeaks were still unfamiliar, but they already carried life into every corner of the cabin. Mason turned and smiled. Hope rested comfortably on the thick blankets beside the fireplace, her amber eyes brighter than they had been the night before. She looked tired, but it was the peaceful exhaustion of a mother whose greatest fear had quietly passed. The two newborn puppies lay tucked against her side, warm, content, and impossibly small. Hope noticed Mason watching them and lifted her head. Their eyes met once again. This time there was no fear inside hers, only calm gratitude. Mason knelt beside her and gently placed a fresh bowl of water within reach. Hope drank slowly before looking toward her puppies with quiet devotion. Every few moments, she nudged them gently with her nose, counting them again as though making certain they were both still there. Mason found himself laughing softly when one tiny puppy stretched no bigger than his own hand before nestling closer against its mother. The sound of his own laughter surprised him. It had become so rare that he barely recognized it anymore. The satellite phone suddenly rang. This time the connection was perfectly clear. Dr. Emily Brooks sounded relieved. She explained that county crews had cleared enough of the mountain road for emergency vehicles to travel safely. She and an animal rescue volunteer were already on their way. "It should take us about 45 minutes, she said. "Keep everyone warm. We are almost there." Mason thanked her and ended the call before glancing back toward the little family beside the fire. "Looks like you are finally getting some professional visitors," he said with a smile. Hope answered by giving a slow wag of her tail against the blanket. Just under an hour later, the quiet mountain air carried a distant sound that had been impossible during the storm. An engine. It grew louder before stopping outside the cabin. Mason opened the front door, and crisp winter air rushed inside, carrying the clean scent of fresh snow and pine. Dr. Emily Brooks stepped carefully onto the porch wearing a heavy insulated coat, followed by a volunteer carrying medical supplies. They entered quietly, immediately lowering their voices when they saw Hope resting peacefully with her puppies. Dr. Brooks knelt beside the family, examining Hope with gentle, experienced hands before checking each tiny puppy one at a time. A warm smile slowly spread across her face. "Their heartbeats are strong," she said softly. "The mother is tired, but she is doing remarkably well. Considering everything she endured, This is nothing short of a miracle. Mason looked toward Hope, who rested calmly while watching every movement around her babies. Dr. Brooks followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. "You gave her more than shelter," she said. "You gave her enough peace to believe she could keep fighting." Mason didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the German shepherd lying comfortably beside the fire, then toward the two tiny lives sleeping against her warm coat. The cabin no longer felt like the lonely place he had returned to after every deployment. The silence inside those walls had changed. It was no longer empty. It breathed. It listened. It belonged to a family that had not existed just 24 hours earlier. As sunlight continued pouring through the windows, Hope slowly closed her eyes, knowing at last that the journey which had begun alone in a deadly winter storm had finally led her exactly where she had always been meant to arrive. The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike anything Mason Carter had experienced in years. The mountain cabin no longer echoed with silence. Each morning began with the soft crackle of the fireplace, the aroma of fresh coffee drifting through cedar walls, and the tiny squeaks of two growing puppies greeting another sunrise. Hope regained her strength a little more each day. The dull exhaustion that had clouded her amber eyes slowly disappeared, replaced by a calm confidence that reflected the peace she had finally found. Dr. Emily Brooks visited every afternoon during that first week, carefully checking the little family before smiling with increasing satisfaction. The puppies gained weight steadily. Hope's appetite returned. Even the scars hidden beneath her sable coat seemed less noticeable as healthy fur gradually covered them again. One snowy afternoon, after completing another examination, Dr. Brooks picked up the old leather collar resting on the kitchen table. She gently polished the faded brass tag with a soft cloth until more of the worn engraving became visible beneath years of weather and neglect. Mason watched quietly as additional letters slowly emerged. On the back of the tag, barely readable, appeared a phone number missing 2 final digits, along with the outline of a tiny mountain emblem stamped into the metal. Dr. Brooks studied it for a long moment before looking up. "I think I have seen this symbol before," she said thoughtfully. "There is a small volunteer search and rescue group about 20 miles north of here. They use a mountain crest that looks very similar." Mason immediately drove there the following morning after Dr. Brooks assured him Hope and the puppies could safely remain at the clinic for a few hours. Fresh snow still covered the roads, but clear blue skies had finally returned to Montana. The search and rescue station was little more than a rustic log building overlooking a frozen valley. An elderly volunteer named Walter Jensen welcomed Mason inside. Walter had spent nearly 40 years helping locate lost hikers, stranded families, and missing animals throughout the surrounding wilderness. When Mason placed the old collar on the wooden desk, Walter's weathered face changed almost instantly. He picked it up with both hands as though holding an old photograph. "I know this dog," he said quietly. "Or at least I know her story." Mason listened without interrupting. Walter explained that nearly 6 months earlier, a young couple traveling through the mountains had rescued a starving German shepherd wandering near an abandoned logging trail. They had named her Hope after discovering how gentle she remained despite everything she had endured. They planned to adopt her permanently after renovating an old family cabin farther up the valley. Then, early in the winter, an avalanche blocked the remote access road leading to their property. Search teams eventually confirmed that the couple had safely evacuated before the worst snowfall arrived, but Hope had disappeared during the confusion. Volunteers searched for weeks without success. Walter looked through the frosted window toward the endless forest. "We always wondered where she went," he whispered. Mason slowly nodded. "She found another cabin." Walter smiled. "Maybe she was not lost after all. Maybe she simply knew exactly where she needed to go." Mason carried those words with him during the drive home. As the cabin appeared through the snow-covered pines, he noticed Hope sitting patiently beside the front window, watching the road as though she had been waiting for him all along. The moment he stepped inside, both tiny puppies stumbled clumsily across the blanket toward his boots, their oversized paws making them wobble with every determined step. Mason laughed as one of them lost its balance before trying again without the slightest hesitation. Hope watched the scene with quiet contentment, her tail brushing gently against the floor. Mason knelt beside her and softly scratched behind her ears. "You traveled all those miles through a blizzard," he murmured. Not because you were running away. You were running toward hope. Hope rested her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes for just a moment while the two playful puppies curled together at their feet. Outside, winter still covered the mountains, but inside the little cedar cabin, every corner had become warmer than any fire alone could ever make it. Winter slowly released its grip on the valley. Weeks passed, and the heavy snow that had buried the mountain trails gave way to sparkling streams fed by melting ice. The frozen lake outside the cabin reflected bright blue skies once again, while patches of green quietly returned beneath towering pines. Life seemed to awaken all at once. So did the little family inside the cabin. The two puppies were no longer tiny bundles wrapped in blankets beside the fire. They had discovered their legs, their curiosity, and their endless desire to explore every corner of Mason's home. Every morning began with the sound of eager paws racing across the wooden floor before one puppy inevitably tumbled into the other. Hope watched them with patient eyes, stepping in only when their playful adventures carried them a little too far from the safety of the porch. Mason often found himself sitting on the front steps after sunrise, a mug of coffee warming his hands while the puppies chased drifting leaves through the fresh mountain air. Hope always remained nearby, never taking her eyes off them for long. Yet every few minutes, she looked toward Mason with the same quiet expression she had worn the morning after the storm. It was not dependence. It was partnership. One afternoon, Dr. Emily Brooks arrived for what she expected would be the family's final routine examination. She watched as one puppy proudly carried a pine cone nearly as large as its own head, while the other attempted to imitate its sibling with determined enthusiasm. Hope calmly supervised every clumsy step. Dr. Brooks smiled before turning toward Mason. "They are all healthy," she said. "I don't think they need me anymore." Mason glanced toward the playful puppies before answering. "Maybe they didn't need rescuing as much as I did." Dr. Brooks looked at him thoughtfully. She remembered the quiet man who had first called through a broken satellite connection during the blizzard. His voice then had carried discipline, but also loneliness. The man standing beside her now still possessed the calm strength of a Navy SEAL, yet something inside him had softened. He laughed more easily. He smiled without realizing it. The silence that once surrounded him no longer felt like a wall. It had become a place where peace could finally live. Before leaving, Dr. Brooks paused beside Hope and gently scratched behind her ears. "You chose the right porch," she whispered. Hope responded with a slow wag of her tail before walking back toward Mason and resting quietly at his side. As the veterinarian drove away, Mason looked across the valley stretching beneath the afternoon sun. He thought about every mission that had shaped his life, every carefully planned operation, every impossible decision, every lesson about endurance and courage. Yet none of those experiences had prepared him for the simple truth now standing beside him. Strength was not measured only by surviving hardship. Sometimes strength revealed itself through gentleness, through staying beside someone who could offer nothing in return except trust. Hope had crossed miles of snow carrying new life beneath her heart. She had reached the edge of exhaustion without surrendering. The puppies had entered the world not because everything had gone perfectly, but because their mother refused to stop believing that somewhere ahead there would be warmth. Mason finally understood why Atlas had remained unforgettable all those years. Loyalty was never simply about protection. Loyalty was choosing love even when fear offered easier answers. As the afternoon breeze stirred the tall pines, one curious puppy wandered farther into the yard before stopping to look back. It waited until Mason and Hope followed together before happily bounding ahead again. Mason smiled quietly. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." Hope walked beside him with calm confidence, her shoulder brushing lightly against his leg. The mountain trail stretched forward beneath a sky washed clean by spring, and for the first time in many years, Mason stepped into the future without feeling as though he were leaving something behind. He had discovered a truth no training manual could ever teach. The strongest hearts are not the ones that never break. They are the ones that remain open enough to welcome another soul after they do. The seasons continued their quiet walk across the Montana mountains, and with every passing week, the little cabin became less like a place where someone lived and more like a place where life itself had chosen to stay. The porch that had once held only silence now greeted every sunrise with the happy rhythm of 4 eager paws racing across weathered wooden boards. The two puppies had grown into healthy, young German shepherds, full of curiosity, courage, and the playful confidence that only comes from knowing they are deeply loved. Hope followed them with calm watchfulness, never far behind, her amber eyes brighter than Mason had ever imagined possible on that frozen morning when she had first appeared at his door. Some evenings, after returning from duty, Mason would sit on the porch beneath a sky painted with gold and crimson while Hope rested beside him, her head leaning gently against his leg exactly as she had done so many times before. The puppies chased butterflies through wildflowers, occasionally tumbling over one another before running back to check that both Mason and their mother were still there. They always were. One afternoon, Walter Jensen stopped by the cabin carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested a freshly engraved brass tag attached to a new leather collar. The front simply read Hope. On the back were a few words that Walter insisted belonged there. Found in the storm. Stayed for the family. Mason carefully fastened the new collar around Hope's neck. She sat perfectly still, then looked up at him with the same quiet trust that had crossed the distance between two strangers months earlier. Mason smiled before gently scratching behind her ears. "Looks good on you," he whispered. Hope answered by touching her nose to the German Shepherd tattoo on his neck one more time. The same gentle gesture that had first reminded him of Atlas beside the fire. Some promises, he realized, never truly ended. They simply found new ways to live. That evening the family walked together along the narrow trail overlooking the lake. The air smelled of pine, wild grass, and fresh earth warmed by the setting sun. Birds drifted across the glowing sky while the water reflected every color of the coming dusk. Mason paused at the overlook and watched the puppies explore the shoreline under Hope's patient supervision. Months earlier, he believed he had rescued a forgotten dog from a winter storm. Standing there now, he finally understood the truth. She had rescued him from a quieter storm that no one else had ever seen. She had led him back to laughter, to peace, and to a home that no longer felt empty when the door closed each night. Some miracles arrive like thunder. Others arrive shivering, exhausted, and carrying hope beneath their heart. They ask for nothing except a chance. And sometimes, offering that chance changes two lives forever. As the last light faded behind the mountains, Mason looked toward the little family walking ahead of him. Hope stopped for a moment and turned back. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They had already said everything that mattered. The trail continued forward beneath the evening sky, and together they walked into tomorrow, leaving behind only quiet footprints and a story that would forever remind anyone willing to listen that kindness is never wasted, faith is never truly lost, and love often arrives when we least expect it. Now we would love to hear from you. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments because your words inspire us to keep telling stories that celebrate compassion, loyalty, and hope. And if this journey stayed with you until the very end, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more heartfelt stories that remind us all that even the smallest act of mercy can change everything.